Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome to The Print. I have with me today Professor M. Fravel. He is the Arthur and Ruth Sloan Professor for Political Science and Director at the Security Studies Program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Welcome to The Print, Professor Fravel. Just to jump in right straight away on the issues that we need to discuss with you today, is basically on the border standoff that India is having with China. Of course, we'll deal with that. But to begin with, my question to you would be, a lot has been discussed and talked about this kind of military adventurism of sorts that China is doing. Countries are calling it an expansionist China. We've seen what's happening with India, with Hong Kong, South China Sea. So basically, my question to you would be, what is it that you think China wants? Where is it headed?
So in all of these territorial issues, I think China has attached great importance to defending what it views to be its sovereignty claims. This indeed is probably a hallmark of Xi Jinping's approach to foreign policy, going all the way back to early 2013, when he linked sort of defending sovereignty to the China dream, and then of course has been sort of emphasized from then on. And in all of these sort of outstanding issues relating to sovereignty, Hong Kong, the border with India, Taiwan, South China Sea, East China Sea, and so forth, we've seen in the last 6 months in particular sort of a much greater willingness on the part of China to sort of assert itself in these various disputes. Now, on the one hand, sort of the nature of China's claims do not appear to have changed. In other words, what it views to be its sovereignty has remained pretty constant for a long period of time. But what has changed, both in the last sort of 8 years under Xi Jinping and then sort of more recently, even in the last 6 months, is really a much greater willingness for China to assert itself, even if that creates greater friction with its neighbors such as India. And so in the case of India, right, you have China kind of moving up to what it views to be the LAC in several areas. With respect to Hong Kong, you have sort of a tightening of control through the national security law. In the South China Sea, you have kind of continued efforts to assert its historic rights, especially in Malaysian and Vietnamese waters. And then around Taiwan, of course, you have an increase in military activity after the re-election, of Tsai Ing-wen earlier this year.
Mm-hmm. So coming to the India issue, the border standoff that has been going on since early May is what the Indian government tells us. How do you see, and this has been one of those, not really one of the regular skirmishes that India sees with China. This has been one where India lost 20 of its soldiers, several injured, although it's not really clear how many soldiers from the Chinese side were injured or probably killed. But why did this happen? And do you think this is also probably going to continue? Is this going to be the trend?
So great question. Let me first, or let me take the first part of your question first and sort of why it happened. I mean, I certainly agree. But what we witnessed on sort of the China-India border in early May is in many ways unprecedented in terms of sort of the scope, scale, and posture of Chinese forces. As I already mentioned, right, in at least 3 locations and now probably more, including the Depsang Plain, China has moved up to what it views to be the line of actual control, and in all of these cases, right across what India views to be the line of actual control, and that is unprecedented in the sense of seeing sort of China move in these disputed areas sort of simultaneously with large numbers of forces. So if we look back to the 2013 or 2014 standoffs, they were similar in some senses in terms of sort of focusing on areas where the two countries don't view the line of control as lying in the same place, but involve far fewer troops and didn't last as long as what we are seeing today. And so the question is why? Why sort of undertake this kind of unprecedented action? And if we're looking at the Chinese side, I would sort of highlight a couple of factors. The first is one I've just talked about in terms of sort of the much greater approach that China has attached to sovereignty. The second, I think, would be the lessons that China learned from the 2017 standoff with India over Doklam, which was a bit different from those in 2013 and 14 because it involved sort of the tri-junction with Bhutan and from China's point of view involved Indian troops sort of crossing an international boundary to sort of prevent China from building a road on a sort of disputed Chinese Bhutanese territory. And I think that action by India took China by surprise. I don't think it was expected, especially that India would be willing at that time to cross an international border. And so since then, we've seen kind of much greater vigilance on the Chinese side to sort of Indian activities along the line of actual control. The third factor would be the creation of Ladakh as a federally administered union territory last August, or sorry, last October, but it was first discussed right last August. I don't think I need to review that for your listeners, but certainly I think that had a pretty strong impact, it would appear, on how China viewed India in resolving the dispute, because the new state of Ladakh, of course, include all of Aksai Chin. That wasn't a new claim on the part of India, but by publishing new maps and making strong statements in Parliament about recovering this territory, I think it certainly got China's attention. Then the fourth and final factor would be sort of the ongoing efforts to build infrastructure in border areas. Of course, China's had sort of a long-standing advantage in some sense, but India's catching up, and in the Western sector in particular, sort of making significant progress with the development of the DS-DBO road and so forth. And so that, I think, was sort of the proximate cause this spring, sort of China looking at sort of the gains India was making in infrastructure, and then sort of, I think, viewing those changes in light of the creation of Ladakh as a union territory and so forth. And so I think that's why China did what it did. I don't think China intended for there to be a deadly clash on the evening of June 15th. I think China's China's willingness to use large numbers of forces in these disputed areas created conditions that greatly increased the probability of a clash. But in my assessment, I don't necessarily view that clash as something that China sought, because if one looks at sort of Chinese diplomacy today, they're very much clearly trying to put the genie back in the bottle, restore China-India relations to a place they were before the clash. China hasn't sort of released its own casualty numbers and so forth. So what this means in the future is a really important question. On the one hand, I think China clearly has made a statement, right, that is much more willing to kind of take a costly action to assert its view on the line of actual control. That will almost certainly, right, increase Indian vigilance. And so we could easily have kind of a spiral of sort of gradually increasing tensions on the border, or certainly perhaps just a much higher level of tension than we've seen in the past. I suspect India will want to prevent any recurrence of these sort of Chinese incursions in the future, which will require sort of India to sort of reconsider how it deploys forces on the border and how it uses them. China, of course, may respond to those. So I think the probability for more incidents on the border will certainly increase in the months and years to come.
Mm-hmm. So if I can ask you on this disengagement process that both sides are now talking about, recently there had been this series of senior commanders level meeting. There had been diplomatic level meetings also. The special representatives had a discussion. And specifically, the government had stated that this particular disengagement is just the phase one of disengagement. It's going to be a long drawn process, it seems. And also the fact that this engagement, right now, that the disengagement process is only focused at addressing face-off situations. So do you think, firstly, that there are more sort of risks and of a potential face-off like we saw what happened in the night of 15th and 16th June? Or do you think, that can be avoided, as you said, that China is now really trying to put the genie back in the bottle?
So my assessment today is that it certainly can be avoided, though, of course, I think it can be avoided because of the tragic events that happened on the evening of June 15th. So I think that was a stark reminder of the underlying danger and potential for escalation on the China-India border. And so I don't, of course, we don't know exactly what happened on the evening of June 15th, right? Some of the details are just quite murky. Even though there have been a number of very detailed accounts that have appeared in the Indian media. But I think that level of kind of confusion over who was sort of supposed to be located where will be cleared up in these talks. And certainly sort of the first steps that we've seen in terms of just the ability to disengage and to keep troops at some distance from each other, 3 to 4 kilometers, is by itself a very positive sign in terms of sort of preventing any recurrence of what we saw on the 15th of June. And so I think sort of military commanders on both sides are well aware of the potential for escalation and the cost of escalation. And it would appear that they're taking a series of very deliberate, sort of well-considered, if perhaps slow steps to ensure that on the one hand, the disengagement can be achieved, and on the other hand, it can be achieved without the return to the levels of violence that we saw on the evening of June 15th.
Mm-hmm. Also, if I can ask you, and I know this will be a little tricky question, but then this is something, you as an expert can enlighten our viewers, is what do you think exactly, could have led to this face-off that happened, and it was a violent face-off, unprecedented for the first time since 1975. And, there were these reports, how Indian soldiers were hit, what had happened exactly. Nobody has a clearer picture. But what do you think could have led to that? And what we get to hear from the government is that it happened while the disengagement was underway. Do you think, that could be the reason, or something else might have triggered it?
I mean, based upon the accounts that I've read, which I'm sure are the same ones that you've seen, I mean, it appears that there was an effort to verify agreements that have been made regarding tents and facilities. There is the destruction, I believe, of at least one Chinese tent, and please forgive me if I don't get all of the details exactly right, because sometimes it's hard to say. But my point is there is some level of activity. Then there was a meeting. It appears between the Chinese and Indian kind of commanders on the site. It appears that in the course of that meeting, a brawl began, and that is not unlike other brawls that we saw earlier this spring at on the border with Sikkim or around Pangong Lake, and not necessarily dissimilar to brawls that we saw in 2017 also at Pangong Lake. And so it would appear that was the spark, and so it was very much sort of a reaction to events on the ground involving the soldiers in this particular location. And so I'm not sure necessarily we can sort of draw broader lessons from that, except that when you have a disputed border and when you have a disputed line of actual control and when you have forces in close proximity to each other, it's really very dangerous. And I mean, it's quite remarkable to me that despite what happened on the evening of June 15th, soldiers, neither Chinese soldiers nor Indian soldiers actually discharged their weapons. That this really had potential in some ways to be an even sort of much broader shooting incident. And so it is terribly unfortunate and tragic, and I don't want to downplay the loss of a life at all. But simply to say that the conditions of a face-off by themselves are just inherently volatile and unstable, and in many cases escalation can be avoided, but in this particular case it wasn't, and then we saw what the consequences were.
Mm-hmm. Also, Professor Fravel, right now in India, there's a lot of discussion going on, and there's two sort of groups who are questioning the kind of border protocols and agreements that both sides, have signed for over this many years. And there are these 5 agreements, which basically harp on the fact that both sides will maintain peace and tranquility at the border areas. So there's this one group that states that, India needs, those are very strong and robust agreements, and India and China need to enforce them, rather more robustly, and then rather than treating them just as another agreement. The other group says that probably, India needs to do away with all these decorative items, if I can use the word, as some expert had once told me. But there's with a changing geopolitical dynamics in a post-COVID world, and with a changed China, probably India needs to have a more comprehensive and more, kind of a border agreement to ensure that such incidents will not take place while they discuss, and in a future, probably sometime in the future, they define the line of actual control.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very important point. I would make the following observation, right? These agreements were signed in 1993 and 1996, and then there's some subsequent agreements. But when they were signed, the line of actual control was a much more sort of ambiguous line in the Himalayas than it is today, because of all of the efforts both sides have made to build infrastructure to be able to patrol up to the line of actual control. And so in some senses, these agreements didn't really anticipate the way in which the border would change in the following 25 to 30 years. And so I think the time is ripe for the two countries to try to consider hammering out a new agreement that would take into account the fact that they can now patrol much more easily all the way up to what each side views to be the line of actual control. And when they do so, it creates tensions. It also creates opportunities for sides to assert themselves like China did that can further escalate the situation. I mean, in a perfect world, I think we would have, in a perfect world, the two countries that actually decide to at least delineate the line of actual control on the ground and agree not to patrol beyond certain points. But this idea that both sides can patrol up to their limits, I think, is just a recipe for further tensions in the future. And so in this way, it's not to say that the earlier agreements should be sort of cast aside, but rather that circumstances have changed. The agreements themselves perhaps are less relevant to the ways in which circumstances have changed, and a new agreement or a new consensus would be needed to be able to adapt to the new situation that we now have on the border.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And also to understand the dynamics that US is playing in all of this, which essentially started with the US-China trade war. We recently heard Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying that it is the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party which is why all this is happening. And it seems that the whole world is coalescing against China. These were his exact words. But I'm sure President Xi is also aware of this and how, things are also getting tensed, even with Australia and other partners that China essentially had. So going forward, how do you think President Xi can control all of these? And what is it that his ultimate objective is?
So, I mean, certainly Xi Jinping is a very strong Chinese leader. Many describe him as the strongest leader since Deng Xiaoping. Some will say even Mao Zedong. I don't want, these comparisons in some ways are academic because he's his own leader, but he's quite strong. And I think if he wants to reorient Chinese foreign policy, he has the capacity to do so. But I think also right now it's a very tenuous moment for China, facing widespread global criticism for its initial handling of the pandemic, facing a really significant decline or deterioration in U.S.-China relations, and then finally still confronting a relatively weak economy. Although China last night published sort of the results for the second quarter. On the one hand, they were sort of positive, I think 3.2% year on year, but on the other hand, also revealed lots of information suggesting a much weaker economy, which after all is sort of the main basis of the party's legitimacy within China. And so we'll have to watch the space. I mean, I think we've talked a lot about how India-China relations are at an inflection point, and it may be the case too, right? The Chinese foreign policy is at an inflection point. And so in the next 6 months, will China sort of double down on the sort of the more assertive approach it's adopted in the spring of 2020, or will it try to recalibrate and stabilize relations with key and important countries going ahead? And I sort of think it's too soon to tell. I think both are possible. And the next 6 months in many ways will tell us a lot about the future of Chinese foreign policy under Xi Jinping.
Mm-hmm. Professor Fravel, my last question to you will be basically on business issues. Now we've seen, and you're watching some of the reports and some of the moves that the government is taking in India in banning the Chinese apps. This is something that was lauded by the US also recently. The US Congress said that, it should take a cue from the Indian government moves. There's this huge anti-China sentiment that's sort of rising in India. Do you think in the longer run, with the kind of, the manufacturing hub and for all the global value chains, is it a feasible option, at least for a country like India, to move away from China and look at other destinations to integrate itself with the global world order as far as value chains and businesses are concerned? What are your views on that?
So I'm not an expert at all on the Indian economy. I guess I would say the following, right? Many major economies around the world have very tight relationships with China for a variety of reasons. I know that India runs a pretty significant deficit with China, which means that it's buying a lot of Chinese products. And so the real question would be, are there going to be alternative sources of supply, or could even some of those products be made in India? This, of course, is what animates in part the discussion about decoupling in the United States, whether or not it's possible to sort of more evenly distribute one's manufacturing bases and attendant supply chains away from China into other perhaps developing economies in the world. Of course, in East Asia, now Vietnam gets a lot of attention. Perhaps some of that might also be able to move to India, could also, from a US perspective, move to Mexico. But these supply chains have been developed really over the last 3 decades, and China is still very much an important manufacturing hub, and perhaps is even more important as sort of economies slow around the world. Companies will have less money for investment, and so I suspect they'll have less money for investment to be able to sort of develop new manufacturing hubs in other countries. And so I think a lot of manufacturing will still be based in China for the foreseeable future, and so countries will have to think just more carefully about, in many ways, the nature of their economic relationship. But I'm not clear, for the U.S., for India, for anyone else, that a clean break or divorce between the world's second largest economy and their economy is something that is actually feasible at the end of the day. And so countries will have to think about which economic interactions and exchanges are sort of mutually beneficial, and which ones, perhaps in the technology area, carry greater risks.
Mm-hmm. Well, Professor Fravel, thank you so much for speaking to ThePrint. Please take care.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a delight to be here.